As the fall season approaches, you may be interested in hearing a few scary stories to get you into the Halloween spirit. Join us as we have a look at some of the most demonic possessions in history. Robbie Manheim. You can probably assume that most of the famous possessions of the past few centuries have been made into movies. The case of Robbie Manheim was made into one of the most famous horror movies in history. William Friedkin's The Exorcist was a movie that was heavily based on the events surrounding the exorcism of young Robbie. Sometime in the 1940s, Robbie was staying over at his Aunt Harriet's place, and that's when he would discover a Ouija board. He would inquire about what the board was for, but rather than tell him, his Aunt Harriet decided to show him what it could do. While using the board, it's said that the two didn't really follow the proper protocol when finishing up their ritual, and soon after his visit, Aunt Harriet would die of unexplained causes. After her funeral, the family then returned home, and Robbie's mother began to prepare dinner. While cooking dinner, Mrs. Manheim began hearing strange noises coming out of Robbie's room. The noises ranged from everything from female voices to weeping children, and Mrs. Manheim simply thought that he was either mourning the loss of his favorite aunt or that she might be misinterpreting the noises she was hearing. When dinner was prepared, she called Robbie downstairs and the family began to eat. During their meal, the two parents began to hear strange voices, the same ones from before. Then all of a sudden, a chair that no one was even near would slide across the room. These strange occurrences continued for a few weeks until the family then decided to seek the counsel of a paranormal expert. They were then able to acquire help from famous parapsychologist J.B. Rhine. Then, after spending a few days in the house with the family, Rhine realized that the paranormal activity would increase when Robbie was in the room. He too would experience many of the events that were reported by the parents. He recommended that the Manheim family seek the help of a Catholic priest in order to have Robbie go through an exorcism. That's when Robbie would go through a series of exorcisms, most of which were not successful. In the most famous of his exorcisms, Robbie was able to escape his restraints, and then he broke off a bed spring that he used to slash the wrists of the priest. The final exorcism would prove to be successful, but also one of the most terrifying. The Jesuit priests and their assistants in attendance reported that Robbie began speaking in tongues, and words like evil and hell began to appear in his skin. Then, as famously shown in the movie, the bed began to shake and the candles began to flicker. And these ended up inspiring the famous scene in the Exorcist movie. After Robbie's exorcism, he then went on to lead a fairly normal life with no further demonic possessions. Clara Germanness. Clara Sele grew up in Natal, South Africa, and from a young age, she had behavioral problems. She was often at odds with the nuns at her school, and clearly believed that the reason she grew up without parents was because of the church. Because of this, she had complete disregard for religion and authority by the age of 16. And the more that the nuns would try to bring Clara closer to God, the more that she would resist. It was at this rebellious time in her life that she allegedly made a deal with the devil, according to some of her classmates. After making the deal, she then went on to confession, telling the father what she had done. The father then recounted the tale, saying that he knew almost immediately that Clara was telling the truth. When he looked up toward the screen, he vividly remembered seeing the silhouette of a man while hearing the distinct voice of a woman. He stood up immediately, turning the corner and seeing Clara kneeling with a sinister smile on her face. Soon after this interaction, Clara's behavior would dramatically change. One nun who was teaching a foreign language class noticed that Clara was suspiciously fluent in German all of a sudden. In addition to this, Clara, who had never left the city of Natal, had mastered Polish, French, and other languages that weren't even taught at her school. The fearful nun decided to test her theory and began to speak to Clara in an arcane microdialect. This was the language that was not spoken outside of a very small, isolated town of people. The nun spoke slowly and asked Clara, "Who are you?" Then, with a smile, she replied in English, "Me." The nun immediately sought the help of the father and requested that Clara go through an exorcism. While the nun was consulting with Father Erasmus, Clara then decided to have some fun with her newfound power. She began going around to other teachers and revealing their deepest, darkest secrets to the class, secrets that had never been told to anyone. By the end of the day, the school had devised a plan to kidnap Clara and perform an exorcism, but little did they know Clara was going to have the strength of 5 grown men. When one teacher would attempt to approach her, she threw him across the room. Eventually, the group was able to wrestle her to the bed to begin, and the nuns in attendance would report that Clara let out a scream that was so loud it shook the grounds of the school and woke up the other students. It seemed that the group was successful in cleansing Clara of the demon. That was until it vengefully returned soon after. A second and more extensive exorcism would take place, and the school would gain permission from the Catholic Church. The ceremony took place in front of 170 students, and fortunately turned out to be successful. Some students reported seeing Clara's body lift over 5 feet in the air before crashing back down to the table. She also went on to live a fairly normal school life after the exorcism, but really little is known about after she left the city of Natal. Rumors would suggest that Clara rekindled her relationship with the devil after leaving the mentorship of the Catholic Church. Annelise Mikkel. Annelise Mikkel is a German woman who grew up in a devoutly religious family during the 1950s and 60s. With the exception of her religious affiliations, she lived a fairly normal life. That was until the age of 16. In 1968, she experienced her first severe convulsion that would leave her hospitalized. Soon after, she was then diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy. Her first issues, though, began in 1970, when her family and physicians began to notice behavior that seemed strange, even for someone in her condition. She would say that she was seeing devil faces in broad daylight, and would also hear various voices, even though nobody was in the room. She also claimed that the voices were telling her to hurt people, and telling her that she was damned to rot in hell. In 1975, they removed her from the care of a trained medical expert and brought her back home, and it was there that she would go through 67 exorcisms, some of which would last over 4.5 hours. During that time, she would stop drinking and eating, and then in 1976, she would die as a result of malnutrition and dehydration. The coroner's report revealed that her ribs had been broken from multiple convulsions, and that her knees had been broken numerous times due to incessant traumas. At the time of her death, she was just a mere 68 pounds. The conditions that surround her death were of obvious legal concern. The parents, as well as the priests, were charged with negligent manslaughter, but were only given 6 months in jail, none of which was ever served. As it turns out, the Catholic Church paid for the family and the priest's legal fees, so they were able to acquire the best lawyers in the country. This included Erich Schmidt-Leichner, a lawyer from the Nuremberg trials who successfully defended numerous Nazi war criminals. Julia. It isn't often that you hear a board-certified psychologist use the word demonic possession as a diagnosis for a patient. However, that's exactly what Dr. Richard Gallagher would do. Gallagher was a professor of clinical psychology at the New York Medical College who was working with schizophrenic patients. In 2008, however, he came across a patient that he simply named Julia, one that he described as one of the most unique cases he'd ever seen. Gallagher would describe himself as a man of science and always looked for a logical explanation for mysterious incidents and behaviors. In the case of Julia, though, he could find no logical or even rational explanation for what was happening. In his journals, where he documented his sessions with her, he would note that objects would often move or fly across the room. Julia would enter into trances, where she would speak in tongues and other foreign languages. And in some cases, she would even speak in voices that sounded completely different from her own. In some cases, she would speak in voices that sounded like an elderly man, and in others, they would be high-pitched shrieks of a woman. Dr. Gallagher would attempt to stay level-headed about the situation. That was until Julia began revealing secrets. Secrets about him and the nurses that no one could have possibly known about. Events so isolated, in fact, that Dr. Gallagher himself would claim that he would have been the only witness to such occasions. After modern psychology had failed to cure Julia, Dr. Gallagher reported her condition to the International Association of Exorcists, all in hopes that they would be able to help her. The Demon Murder Trial. 1981 was the first time that demonic possession was used as a legitimate defense in the United States court of law. That's when a man by the name of Arne Cheyenne Johnson murdered his drunken landlord and then claimed that he was possessed by a demon during the event. Even Johnson's wife would note that in the moments prior to the stabbing, he began to gutturally growl and make noises that she had never even heard a human being make before. The possibility of Johnson's possession was corroborated by famous demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren. Just a few months prior to the murder, the Warrens were investigating an alleged possession, one that just so happened to center around the family of the Johnsons. Warren's argument was that the demon, or the entity that was possessing the friends, likely attached itself to the Johnsons during some sort of interaction. The family friends had allegedly experienced events that were not of their control, ones where they had no control of their own bodies, in fact. Events that so strongly resembled what Arne Johnson had described himself. The judge then decided that demonic possession was not really a viable argument in the court of law and would ask the jury to treat it as a possibility of self-defense. It would take over 15 hours of deliberation across the course of 3 days before the jury finally convicted Johnson of murder. He would then be given 20 years in prison, but only served just a quarter of that sentence. To this day, Lorraine Warren Johnson's belief is that Arne was actually possessed by the devil or a spirit during the time of the murder. To understand how it all began, we go to Wisconsin for a visit with Gags, the Green Bay Clown. It was the 1st of August of this year when pictures of Gags surfaced on social media and prompted concerned citizens to call the police. In the grainy images, the clown is seen carrying black balloons, donning a worn and dirty clown suit and full makeup. At the time, it was believed to be part of a B-horror